When Judge Harold Thompson slammed his gavel and fined Jasmine Crockett for contempt in a charged courtroom showdown, he thought he'd put a young, overzealous lawyer in her place. But what followed wasn't just a challenge to his authority, it was a revelation of brilliance. In the heat of legal battle, Jasmine didn't just defend her client. She exposed a mind so precise and relentless, it forced the judge to reevaluate his own judgment. Jasmine Crockett entered Judge Thompson's courtroom on a humid Thursday morning in late June, carrying more than just a case file. She carried the burden of her client's future. At 28, only 2 years out of law school, she worked at a small firm that handled tough pro bono cases. Her client, Lena Rodriguez, a single mother of 2, was facing eviction from the home she had lived in for more than 10 years. The landlord, a real estate developer named Richard Grayson, aimed to turn the aging apartment complex into upscale condos. His legal team, 2 seasoned attorneys from a powerful downtown firm, had years of courtroom experience. Jasmine, though, far newer to the game, possessed something they didn't: a fierce belief in justice and a mind that consumed legal codes the way others devoured novels. The case had dragged on for weeks. That Thursday, Jasmine had spent the night buried in housing regulations, tenant rights laws, and obscure case precedents. She had uncovered a key provision in the Fair Housing Act requiring landlords to provide relocation assistance in cases like Lena's, a clause Grayson's team had conveniently ignored. But bringing it to Judge Thompson's attention proved no easy task. Judge Thompson, a 63-year-old jurist with over 2 decades on the bench, was known for his brisk courtroom style. That morning, he had already overruled 3 of Jasmine's objections, barely looking up from his notes. The documents she flagged were incomplete or improperly filed, but he dismissed her challenges with clipped responses. Overruled. Sustained, never inviting deeper argument. By the 4th objection, Jasmine's restraint was wearing thin. Still, she stood firm. "Your Honor," she said calmly, "I object to the admission of the landlord's financial statement. It's dated after the eviction notice and isn't relevant to the conditions at that time. The Fair Housing Act requires—" "Crockett," the judge cut in, looking up at last. "That's enough. The document is admitted. Move on." Jasmine gripped her hands behind her back to keep her frustration in check. She refused to let this slide. "With respect, Your Honor," she said, "the statute specifies that all evidence must reflect the conditions at the time of notice." "This violates that requirement, Miss Crockett," the judge said sharply. "You're trying my patience. I've ruled. Sit down." But Jasmine didn't sit. She had seen too many cases like this crumble because no one pushed back. "Your Honor, I have a duty to ensure this court follows the law. If I may cite the relevant—" "Enough," Thompson barked, slamming his gavel. "You're out of line. I find you in contempt of court. $500 payable by end of day. If you want that doubled, keep talking. Now sit down." The room fell silent. Lena looked at Jasmine with wide eyes. Across the aisle, Grayson's lawyers exchanged smug glances. Jasmine stood still for a beat. The fine stung less than the dismissal of her argument. She gave a short nod and sat, but her thoughts were already turning. Back in her modest office, shared with 2 other young attorneys, Jasmine opened her laptop. The fine wasn't just a reprimand, it was a dare. She had faced skeptical professors, patronizing colleagues, and rigid gatekeepers before. She had never backed down when it mattered, and this time was no different. She dug into her legal database, cross-referencing contempt statutes, judicial conduct rules, and precedent. In that jurisdiction, a contempt citation could be challenged within 48 hours if it lacked proper basis. Jasmine planned to use every one of those hours. By midnight, she had found what she needed: case law and procedural missteps. She discovered a 1987 ruling in Re Carter, where a contempt charge was overturned because the judge hadn't explained how the lawyer's conduct had disrupted proceedings. Then came Pounders v. Watson, 1997, a federal case affirming that due process required attorneys be allowed to respond before being fined. Judge Thompson hadn't given her that chance. Armed with precedent, Jasmine drafted a motion contesting the fine. It was short, sharp, and flawless. She argued the fine had been imposed without following required procedures and that her objections were in good faith, not willful disruption. She filed the motion first thing the next morning, requesting a hearing before Judge Thompson. The hearing was scheduled for the following Tuesday. When Jasmine entered the courtroom that day, something had changed. There was a new tension in the air, something that felt less like routine and more like a test. Judge Thompson's expression was unreadable as he opened the hearing. "Miss Crockett," he said, "you've requested to contest the contempt citation. You have 10 minutes. Jasmine stood, holding her notes but barely glancing at them. She had this committed to memory. "Thank you, Your Honor. On June 27th, during Rodriguez v. Grayson, I was fined $500 for contempt. I respect this court's authority, but I contend the fine lacked due process and did not meet the legal standard for contempt." She let that sink in before continuing. Under state law, contempt requires willful disruption. My objections were made to ensure compliance with the Fair Housing Act. In In re Carter, the court overturned a similar fine due to lack of justification. No such justification was provided here. The judge leaned forward slightly. Jasmine continued. Furthermore, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in Pounders v. Watson that due process demands an opportunity to respond before punishment. I was not given that opportunity. The fine was imposed without warning. She closed her argument with calm conviction. My actions were not disrespectful. They were rooted in my obligation to defend my client. Elena Rodriguez faces losing her home. If standing up for her rights crosses a line, then I'll cross it every time. But it is not contempt. She sat. The room was silent. Judge Thompson looked at her, his fingers drumming lightly on the bench. "You've cited some compelling cases," he said at last. "Frankly, I expected a less measured argument. But let me ask, doesn't an attorney also need to know when to stop pushing?" Jasmine didn't flinch. "Yes, Your Honor. But we must also know when to keep going. I couldn't walk away when justice was at risk." The judge gave a small nod. "Very well. I'll take this under advisement. You'll have my decision tomorrow." The next day, Judge Thompson issued his ruling. In a written order, he rescinded the $500 fine, stating that Jasmine's actions, while persistent, did not meet the standard for contempt. He admitted he hadn't provided a clear rationale or allowed a response, violating precedent in Pounders v. Watson. More surprisingly, the judge acknowledged her skill. "Counsel's command of the law and her advocacy are commendable," he wrote. "This court recognizes her diligence and expects it will serve her well in future proceedings." Word of the ruling spread fast. A local legal blog called it "The Day a Rookie Took on the Bench and Won." Attorneys who had once dismissed Jasmine as inexperienced started calling for her advice. Law professors began referencing her motion in class. Elena's case was still ongoing, but things had shifted. Judge Thompson began treating Jasmine with respect, even revisiting prior rulings to consider the evidence she had initially been blocked from presenting. Jasmine didn't dwell on the attention. She went back to preparing her arguments, focused on Elena and the bigger fight. Still, something had changed. In that courtroom, Jasmine Crockett hadn't just defended her client. She had made a name for herself. And Judge Harold Thompson, a man who thought he'd seen it all, discovered that he hadn't seen anything quite like her. Jasmine Crockett was no ordinary attorney. And that day in June wasn't just another hearing. It was the day she showed the legal world exactly what she was made of. Not flash or bravado, but brilliance, backbone, and the courage to speak when it mattered most.